Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Maureen O'Connor from Quilters Heaven in Northbrook, Illinois, and I am the Opinionated Quilter. Today's episode, number 30, I'm going to share with you a quilt using your leftover 2.5-inch strips. But before we get to that, let's get to my opinion. And if you haven't done so already, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. I've noticed many people have difficulties with stitch length and stitch tension. I've got a couple examples here. This one is a 2.5 stitch length and this one is a 1.8. And if you do as much strip piecing as I do, after you sew your strip sets and cut them apart, you don't want them to easily pull apart while you're working on them. And if you do so, they can start to come apart with a too long stitch length. On the 1.8, I can pull it, but it doesn't come apart. So if your pieces are coming apart as you're working on them, check your stitch length. Another issue is stitch tension, and oftentimes I see pieces that are sewn together and I see what I call little railroad tracks. And when you see those stitches there like that, you know that you either have too long of a stitch length and or too loose stitch tension. So when you're pressing your blocks and pieces together and you see, I think they're like railroad tracks, then I would just definitely check my stitch tension and I would stop sewing until I got that adjusted properly. Okay, let's get to the episode. I designed this quilt behind me using 2.5-inch strips. While I generally like 1.5-inch strips better, I find that I have way more 2.5-inch strips, and I decided be best to tackle them first. This is one of two 2.5-inch strip boxes that we have. So I took 50 strips and paired them together into twos and made this block, which is called Illinois Road, be fitting for this shop. So after taking each set of two and sewing it full width of fabric, I then subcut into 4.5-inch squares. How do we know 4.5? Back to quilter's math. 2.5 minus the seam allowance becomes 2. 2 twos is 4. Add the seam allowance back on, and you have 4.5. So you know you're cutting 4.5-inch squares. I then laid out my squares to get this pinwheel showing. And you can get 2 full blocks from each strip set with a little bit of waste, which I'm going to make into little 4-patch blocks. Maybe a different quilt, maybe on the back of this quilt, but they'll get used. So after I lay these out, we then sew them together. I sew these together and these together, press my seam allowance to the left on the top row, to the right on the bottom row, sewed them together with the seam allowance pointing up so that the feed dogs help you and push them together. I love this block for beginners because where the seams meet, it's all the same fabric. So if they're not perfect, it's not very noticeable. But with your feed dog's help, they pretty much come out perfect every time, even without any pins. Now I laid mine out with one color in the center on one block, and then I reversed it for the other color in the center for the other block. And you can see that here and here. I took my own advice trying symmetry. Remember what we talked about Karen Brown doing symmetrical? Well, that's what we did here. Everything is opposite. So I hope you can see this on the camera. Here, these are the same fabrics. These are the same fabrics. These are exactly opposite. These are exactly opposite, and so on and so forth. You can't see the bottom right corner, but it's the same fabric as the top left corner. And so I found that layout worked really well for me. Now, I got 50 blocks because we had 25 strip sets, 2 per block. So what I did was I laid it out, and I don't know if you remember this from the diagonally set video that we did, but you go in odd numbers. Your upper left corner has 1 block in it. Your next row comes down and it has 3. The next row comes down and it has 5. So when I get to 9, that's 25 blocks. So half of my quilt's going to be the top half with 25 blocks, and the bottom half is going to be the other half of the blocks, 25 blocks. Now, I've done diagonally set quilts before, and you've seen this one before. This one, I used cornerstones that come all the way out to the edges. And I decided that I only wanted to do the cornerstones on the inside of this quilt, and in the inside of the blocks, not in the setting triangles. So I ran into a little problem, solvable, but I want to make you aware of it. It doesn't happen on this. This all works easy. I came into a little problem. I have to switch out the whiteboard. So give me 1 second and I'll show it to you. I don't think you could see the setting on the quilt behind me, so I drew it out here. Here's the corner block. Here's the row with 3. Here's the row with 5. Here's the row with 7. Now we get to the 9. This is the middle of the quilt. This section would be turned around and finishing the square here. Now, the issue that I had, because I wanted a rectangular quilt, you have to have at least 2 of the middle number of blocks together. So when I got to 9, if I'd gone down to 7 next, I would get a square quilt. I wanted a rectangular quilt, so I had a row of 9 and a row of 9, but you have to shift it down. So on the top row of 9, you have a corner triangle, and you have a side setting below it, and the opposite down here. On the corner up here, the ending triangle is a side setting, and the corner is on the bottom 9. Now, if you look at this closely, you can see before I can put this side setting triangle on, I have to have this piece attached to this block. Before I put this side setting triangle on, I have to have this piece set onto this block. So do I sew this row of sashing and cornerstones onto this row, or do I sew it onto this row? You can't do either. And that's because you have to have this below and this above. So the solution is a partial seam. If you've not done partial seams before, they're not hard. They're easy. You just have to know what you're going to do is only sew part of the seam. So I took this row of sashing, sewed it onto this bottom 9 about halfway. Then I was able to sew this side setting triangle onto here. Did the same thing down here. I sewed this end of the same sashing cornerstone row, but I sewed it onto this side, the top 9. And then I was able to sew this side setting triangle on. Once you get those sewn, it's really easy to go back and finish this row and finish this row. It sounds confusing to start with, but it's really quite easy. I know many of you out there have lots and lots of 2.5-inch strips to use for this project. I wouldn't buy a new jelly roll for it. First, there's not enough strips. But secondly, I think the success of this quilt, the vibrancy of this quilt, is due to the variety of the colors, of the patterns. A jelly roll would bring too much matchy-matchy to it. So if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, happy sewing.